Welcome to today's edition of Working the Word. Today we're going to be looking at history. That's looking back and see what it's going to contribute to our understanding of the Bible.
Sounds good.
And I guess we have only what's left behind. And digging up history, we've got a name for that, haven't we?
We do.
It's called archaeology. And it's a mixture of history, of geography. It involves looking at places, at times, at people. And when we put those all together, we can get an interesting mix.
Because often I think our tendency is to sort of read it as words on a page and, it's kind of an interesting story, but we close the book. Whereas when you start looking at, it within this is where it happened, or, understanding its space in the timeline that, it came after this and it was before this and how it fits with that, or even understanding that the characters really are human people who, struggle to get out of bed in the morning, or it kind of makes it come alive in a different way, I think.
Even had some mornings where they didn't want to get out of bed.
Yes.
And so, really, this is building on some of the timelines that we've already put. These books fitted into a time, and the people, obviously, in the books fit into a time. And so when we think about Abraham, if we can understand the culture in which he lived,
particularly if we're looking at the promise of Isaac, and we see the story of Sarah giving her handmaiden to Abraham because, she didn't think she could come through. From a modern perspective, that sounds a little bit barbaric, but in, Mesopotamia at the time, that was a regular practice, not an unusual thing.
And if you couldn't have children, to leave your belongings to your servant. And you just wrote into your will that if you had a child, then all this changes. Adjust. So we're going to be looking at people and places and times in today's program. And it's interesting just to look at some of the geography that we're dealing with. Here we have what's left at Tel Dan. They say about Israel from Dan to Beersheba. Well, Dan's right up the top, a walled city, a place that wasn't always as observant as it could have been to the ways of God. As we go further down and we get into the wilderness down around the Dead Sea, we come to Qumran.
You've got a little cave down there.
A little cave, Cave 4, one of the caves that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in.
There's sort of an interesting that you can kind of, that looks like a reasonably difficult place. They've gone to some significant effort to make sure that this would be preserved.
Obviously, the scriptures were important, and they had whole structures there that were given to copying the scriptures and other holy writings that they had.
And then making sure they'd be kept safe.
And they also had their ceremonies. And so when we look at this mikvah, it's a little bit worse for the years that have gone by.
To be fair, though, it's been a few.
Well, that's more than 2,000. And you'll notice on this side there's steps going down, and on the other side there's steps coming up out. This was where they did their ceremonial washing, a little bit like baptism. And there's some theories that John the Baptist actually may have been orphaned young and been brought up by people at Qumran. We don't know, but there's been some speculation. But this would have been filled up with water, and you went in, took your ceremonial bath, and then you couldn't walk out on the same steps or you'd get dirty.
Make you unclean.
So you walked in one side and you walked out the other side. And we get just an introduction to the whole concept of washing, ceremonial washing, and maybe even the background to Christian baptism.
And particularly when, you're looking at some of the great lists of rules and stuff, some of the ceremonial stuff can seem really removed, but You know, it's still kind of starting to give it a place in a context that.
And that this was important to them.
Yeah.
And they were big on the washing of the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And when Jesus came along, Jesus was much more saying, well, washing the outside is good, but where you really need to be washed is on the inside. And so in this context, Jesus' message of being clean on the inside particularly suddenly starts to take...
And it builds on, you know, things that are already important in their culture. Mm-hmm. That, you know, the being ceremonially clean is something that's really important. But if you want to be even more clean, and like it's not a new idea. The being clean on the inside is something that has come up through time. It's not that Jesus is just introducing some new idea, but he's able to build on things that are already important to them and already part of their daily lives.
And not negate it, but simply to push it that little bit further to where they should have been. It's much easier to be strong on the externals than to be strong on what's happening on the inside. Just a family snap from the Valley of Elah. Now, everybody knows what happened in the Valley of Elah. I'm willing to be pretty sure there's hardly a child watching today who doesn't know what happened in the Valley of Elah.
They might not know it, but they know it.
They know it, but they just don't know what it is that they know. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's a clue down there. There's a stream in the middle, and it's rather a rocky stream bed. Hill up the other side. And once upon a time, a little boy, well, not a little boy, a young man, walked through the stream bed and picked up 5 smooth stones. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we're giving a clue. The Valley of Elah is the place where David picked up some stones, went across and confronted a giant. And he only needed one of the 5. He had some left over. And some have said that's because Goliath had some brothers.
Again, it's one of the things that, you know, we're not given all the details. The Bible writers don't think it's important for us to know them. And sometimes, you know, if the Bible writers are giving us details, it's a really big clue that we're supposed to be paying attention here, because usually they'll only give you the barest, this is what you need to know, moving on.
Well, papyrus was expensive. Mm-hmm. Scribes' time was expensive. You couldn't just go and make a photocopy of it. So sometimes just seeing the location where something happened, it informs our imagination a little bit.
This is one of the characters I think that is really interesting if you're wanting to do a deep dive on a character, because there is just so much written about him, both in terms of, you know, documenting his you know, early years before he was king, you know, while he was king. But we're also kind of, you know, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel are sort of the background for the sort of kind of the first half of Psalms. Mm-hmm. And there are some really clear links, like in 2nd Samuel 1 and 2, 11 and 12, you've got the whole story of David and Bathsheba, which isn't particularly G-rated, but then you've got Nathan confronting him. Now, earlier you've had Samuel confronting Saul over something similar, and Saul's response was, I have sinned, but, you know, come with me and so we can do the sacrifice. Basically, you know, I don't want to lose face. Whereas David's response was, I have sinned. And if you look at Psalm 51, it says, you know, this is the psalm that he wrote after the whole Nathan Bathsheba incident. And it's, you know, cleanse me. And it's one of the psalms that we, you know, typically know bits and pieces from, that, you know, that psalm is linked back to this story. And you can kind of, with David, often see both, yes, the narration of what was going on, but also, you know, the inner experience, what he was thinking, what he was feeling, pouring his heart out. So you're kind of getting an inside glimpse that you don't get with a lot of the other characters, that you're just sort of told this is what they did and what they said and moving on.
And sometimes we do see them just as words on a page, rather than as people who had emotions, who struggled with different issues, who had different personalities.
Yes. And I mean, like, even just, most dynasties of the time, the way you described your king, or the way the king chose for himself to be described, because it wasn't your choice, was very much about, his greatness, his conquests, all the, people he'd taken over, the victorious feats he'd done.
The heads he'd banged and the butts he'd kicked.
Whereas, the picture of David that is given is really, really quite human. Like, he's shown with all his flaws and his faults, and, you're getting this picture of a godly man, but a man who still has failings and faults, which is really unusual of kind of the time of, what records you tend to keep of your king.
And at times almost a lonely king, like a sparrow on a housetop, I think he described himself.
And even things like, there's looking at some of the Psalms, you get the feeling he may have struggled with depression at times.
As did some other Bible characters.
Yeah, there's a few. The other thing is he's really struggled with parenting.
Yeah, that wasn't a strong point, was it?
It really wasn't. And I mean, it's easy to kind of just look at him as just kind of this, kid who played for Saul and like defeated a giant and was kind of a king for a while and stuff. But when you look at the real human aspects, like he struggled with so many things, and you've got such a detailed account of, that working through that journey, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and this is where history is informing our picture of what's happening.
And I think sometimes we need to sort of stop, because, like, if we're just reading it as a story, like we finish the story, we go, oh, okay, that happened, cool, move on. Whereas if you sort of stop and go, okay, what was it like? What would it have been like facing that choice, or, facing the giant? Was he a little bit anxious? Was he calm? Like, just what did it look like? What did it sound like? Just kind of bringing it alive based on, using the facts to inform your imagination, and then just kind of seeing how it comes alive.
And you're talking imagination as something that's a positive thing.
Very much. Because sometimes it can be seen as a negative thing, but I think it's sort of your mind's ability to make something a lot more real. So if you're just kind of reading it, you can dismiss it a bit more. Whereas if you're going, Daniel in the lion's den, what would that have sounded like and smelt like and, tasted like? What would have looked like? What would Daniel have felt like when he was thrown down there? What would his spending in that night there be? And you can live in the story a little bit more than if you're just kind of reading and this happened.
Mm-hmm. And if you're picking up their personality, because there's a whole range of personalities that are coming through.
There really is. Like, if you look at someone like Peter or Paul, I'm like, clearly we can't be sure, but I'm fairly sure they were extroverts.
Yeah, probably.
You just kind of got this sort of, doing before thinking sometimes. You've got this absolute, always seeming to be in the center of people, whereas you've got people more like Jeremiah, maybe even Luke, who kind of come across more as introverts. Mm-hmm. That Barnabas, I think, is another one that might be an introvert.
Quiet and yet a very powerful encourager in his own way. And
so starting to see them as people and, connecting to them as people with characters and personalities sort of helps us, I think, understand a lot more of what they wanted or what they were trying to do. I think particularly with Paul, if you understand a little bit more of his personality and, the world in which he lived and what he was addressing, some of the stuff he writes makes a lot more sense.
And that needs to be taken in terms of history and time and place.
Yeah.
Also. This one is in an unusual place. This is a prison. Mm-hmm. Underneath the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, I'm not sure, does that sound like an odd place to have a prison to you?
I wouldn't typically think under the high priest would be but, given the climate of the time, I guess it's not unusual.
It wasn't a place of mercy, it was a place of power. Mm. And most probably Jesus spent a lot of that Thursday night before the crucifixion
In that hole.
somewhere down in underneath Caiaphas's house, securely under lock and key.
And I mean, clearly you can visit there, but, you can sort of imagine what it would have been like being able to sort of see and sitting on a cold stone floor.
Probably not, because probably you were shackled to...
Well, the stone is still cold.
Yes. The luxury of sitting down, maybe not. And just moving around Israel, we're just sampling a few places today, just reminding ourselves that history is about time and place and people. And here we've come to the city of Megiddo, sort of midway around the country. What we have in the middle here is a circular stone altar. And that doesn't sound very much like Israelite religion.
It doesn't, does it?
Like, yes, they did have stone altars, but something that size, something circular.
You don't need to have something that size unless what you're sacrificing is a bit bigger than, the lambs and...
So it's just an interesting one. It reminds us that the worship of Israel, when we start to talk about their worship, that there were times when they lost sight of where they were supposed to be.
And particularly looking at this, over a spectrum of time, that, they were humans. Sometimes they did great, sometimes not so great. They got waylaid and sometimes there is evidence that sometimes they fell off and sometimes they were doing better. And
simple things like preparing for a famine or a siege. So there's this large circular grain store, which probably when it was full to the top wasn't a very scary place to come into. But as the grain was getting down towards the bottom, I'm pretty sure it was a much more scary place to visit, to come down those stone steps and say...
I mean, you've got the stone steps, which I'm personally not that keen on the idea of climbing down, but you've also got, if you're getting to the bottom of the storage, then it probably means this has been going on for a while. Everyone's a bit anxious, the nerves are a bit fraught. You're not really sure, is there more after this? Are we going to survive this siege? You've got sort of, there's very much in the human experience of...
We are getting to the bottom of the barrel, yes. Literally. And then we've got what have been identified as stables. Many years they were talked about as Solomon's stables. But more recently they said, no, we don't think it's Solomon, we think it's King Ahab. And so we've suddenly got a little leap into the whole story of Ahab and Jezebel.
And it's one of the things with archaeology is that there is a degree of kind of changing understanding that, what for ages this was thought to be of Solomon. And then kind of we start putting more pieces together and going, oh, okay, actually that doesn't fit as well as we thought it did.
And there's a number of cities like this that have had to be reworked.
Yeah.
Jericho was another one. Professor Garstang came and said, well, look, yeah, this is it. And then Kathleen Kenyon came along and said, no, wrong dating. And the more recent people have come along and re-looked at it and said, we think Garstang was right.
Yes.
So we have what is, and then we have an interpretation that we put upon it.
And sometimes the limited information we have makes making something, precise interpretations more difficult than other places.
So it's interesting to look at it and say, well, look, we've got stables. When you have stables, you have animals. That's the whole purpose of it. When you have animals, you need to have...
feeding troughs.
A feeding trough.
Otherwise known as...
a manger. Now, how does that mess with your picture of the Christmas story? These nice little well-manufactured wooden mangers that seem to find their way into the nativity scenes.
I mean, if they're at home, it's a possibility. Joseph was a carpenter and all, but they weren't at home. And Mary placing him in a manger. I don't know how many mothers out there have had, thought about putting their newborn in a box like that. But
we come to realise timber wasn't the most available commodity. And so here they are. There's plenty of stone in Israel. So you made your horse trough out of...
You don't waste the good stuff on the cattle feed.
Yeah, so a manger. It just introduces us to seeing things a little bit differently. And
I think even sometimes, recognising that how we understand something is not necessarily how they understood something. Like, we have there's a British monarchy. We understand what kings and queens are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the way they understood kings and queens directly relates to how we do. And so sometimes there's this, we have a basic understanding of this, but there might actually still be a bit of a culture difference.
And even if we understand our current monarchy with the Russian monarchy, who were a different style of leadership altogether.
And so there's kind of it's clearly an incomplete picture, but we're sort of just trying to get bits and pieces from where we can to get an understanding of what it was like.
From Megiddo, we can look out over the fields, and up in the distance there is a mountain range. And it's called the Mount Carmel mountain range. It reminds us of another very important story that happened in the history of Israel, where King Ahab, who owned all these horses and chariots, had to front up to the prophet of God doing his job. And we'll talk more about prophets and their role and how to understand prophets in next week's program. But here's Prophet Elijah saying to Ahab, listen, you want rain, you better meet me up on top of the hill there.
Which is an incredibly gutsy move. Like, he's challenging the most powerful person, in that region at least, basically to a standoff. That, it's a gutsy move for once. And, even just watching how he does it, like he makes his point, I think, but, he's not just sort of sitting back and watching it happen. He's, maybe he's the prophets of Baal, maybe he's asleep, maybe you need to shout louder. Like, he's almost having a little bit of fun with it, but there's a confidence that, he knows God's going to come through. And, you've got God coming through in a really miraculous way. And then you have Ahab running back to Jezebel, who is sort of the instigator of a lot of the mess at the time. And then you've got somehow Ahab is in his chariot, and somehow with this burst of Elijah manages to run ahead.
For quite a long distance.
Like, you can sort of understand a degree of adrenaline, but still that's got to wear out, and it's quite a long distance he runs.
And by the next morning it has run out.
It really has. And like, there are some suggestions that he might have also suffered from depression. Like, you've got this massive mountaintop experience. God has come through in a really powerful way. And then suddenly the next day he's essentially going, there's nothing left for me here. It's all a failure.
I wish I'd never been born. I wish I could die.
Which, that's a really quick dip. And I find the response of God to be really interesting in this one, because God doesn't sort of, chastise him for his lack of faith or anything. God basically just sort of provides for his basic needs.
Lets him run. And then when he kind of gets to where he thinks he should be going, God just sort of quietly approaches him with questions. It's not a, you should be doing this, or you have little faith or anything. It's a, God approaches him really gently. Sends an angel, gives him something to eat and drink, lets him have a good sleep, and then asks some questions.
And I think, just if we do look at it, the context of, he may have been struggling with depression, that, God has dealt with him incredibly gently, but just, made sure his basic needs are met. Presence, let him go through it, and just sort of asking questions. And I think, there's some glimpses we can get here of God dealing with humans and how we should be dealing with humans.
And even with ourselves. Because what do they say? 1 in 5 will suffer from a depression at some stage in their life.
And yet it's something that, is particularly not talked about, especially among Christians. But, if you look through the Bible, there's plenty of examples like Naomi. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which I think means bitter. Even, Job and Job's wife, incredible amounts of grief, understandable levels of, depression and I wish I'd never been born. You've got so many examples here where people have struggled, and yet it's something that we sort of don't really see in them, because if we're not bringing them alive as humans who are experiencing life, which has challenges and obstacles and just sometimes it's too much, it kind of doesn't come through. We're just sort of seeing it as and this happened and moving on.
So seeing people, real people with emotions, with three-dimensional lives, is just such an important part of looking back at the Bible in the context of history.
Yeah.
When we look at archaeology, we're also looking at time. And we see the Bible having its own, this happened and then he reigned for 30 years and then But it's useful sometimes to put that in the context of, well, can we hook that into the chronology of the other nations around?
Because often we sort of have this almost, this is the Bible history and this is all the other history, that there's, we don't have a lot of kind of space in the middle where, this happened and this happened at the same time.
Or getting accounts of the same event from both sides.
And even in the Bible, there's places where we have multiple accounts of the same events.
And down in Egypt, we have records of when Ramses went out to fight the Hittites. And when you read it on the walls of the temples in Egypt, you would think he was the greatest thing around, that he beat the daylights out of them, until you go and read the Hittite account. And they tell a very different story.
Well, even the Hittites, for the longest time, the Bible was really the only reference we had to them, and a lot of scholars assumed that they weren't actually a real thing.
Well, I think one encyclopedia said a mythical people only found in the Bible.
But
and then they began to discover the ruins up in Turkey and realised that this was a massive empire in its day. Well, that's another story.
it is.
But what we've discovered is that there are asynchronisms between the story of Israel and Judah and the nations around about. Because the nations around about were also keeping track of their story and their exploits. And so here we have a monolith that's just a single piece of stone. How King Ahab sent 2,000 chariots and 10,000 men contributing to a fighting force against Shalmaneser and helped to defeat him in the Battle of Karkar in 853. And we read that story in the Bible. And we say, these
Line up.
Over in modern day Jordan, in those days it was called Moab, they found a stone dating from around about 840, 841, and it talks about things like the house of David. It names names that are found in the Bible like Omri, Ahab, Israel. It even mentions Yahweh. Really what we have here is confirmation of the information that we've seen in the Bible.
And pretty much in every case, where archaeology has been sort of discovered, it's basically lined up with what we know about the Bible.
And when it hasn't, we have to put it aside and wait a little while. Another one from around about the same time, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. And there's just this little line, and you can see this figure down on his knees in front of Shalmaneser. And Shalmaneser writes, in the 18th year of my rule, I received the tribute of Jehu, the son of Omri. We read pretty much the same story in the historical books of the Old Testament. Another stealer. Just before the 800 BC, I received the tribute of Jehoash, the Sumerian. Obviously, the northern kingdom, he had his capital in Samaria. That makes him Sumerian. And we know from the Bible that they were contributory to the king of Assyria's.
Another tribute?
Another tribute. I received tribute from Menahem of Samaria. And here's a pair of prisms. They both tell pretty much the same story. They both mention Manasseh as one of 22 kings who they co-opted to provide labour to transport lumber for Esarhaddon's palace.
Once again, you're getting this picture of them within, yes, a place and a time, that there were nations around them that, they had communication and were working with some of them at times.
And what's more, these nations were into watching the stars and recording astronomical observations. In 1 year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule, there's a tablet known as VAT 4956. And it was a record basically of a year of astronomical observations. Eclipses, where the different planets were when it happened, the phase of the moon. And we can calculate back and say, oh, yes, that was the year. And we have multiple of these observations of astronomical data.
It kind of gives us some reference points as to where things were, because it's not always clear because the dates themselves weren't completely a priority in this account, because that wasn't the most important thing they needed to know.
And even now we're counting backwards because it's BC, but you can't count BC before Christ. So this helps us actually to lock some dates into place. The stars and all that, they just don't mess. And so we've got a whole lot of these, I've made them red lines there, where we can synchronise the story from Assyria, Babylon, Moab, and we can actually put dates on things. And from those dates, we can make some calculations. Time is important. And as far back as we can go with certainty is where we've put that dark blue line there, 931 BC. This is just after the death of King Solomon. And this is the date for the dividing of the kingdom into the northern, or Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin. And everything else beyond that we calculate off that date.
And I mean, we can still get some reasonably appropriate approximations of about when things were, but we don't sort of have that confirmation of when.
Well, with the time of Solomon, we know he reigned 40 years. We know the year that he built the temple. And the temple was built in the 480th year after they came out of Egypt.
So you've got the kind of these little milestone markers that we can get some information off, but it's not a giving us the dates for the sake of posterity or anything.
It gives us close enough dates. Beyond that, we have to add genealogies. Which
can be fraught.
They are. And the concern I have with the genealogies is nowhere does it say, we've had all these ones. This guy was this old when he had kids, and then he lived another. Oh, that works. And after you've had 10 of them, it never adds it up and says, and all the years from this one to this one were this many years. And then we get to Luke's gospel, and Luke chucks in a couple that weren't
the original chronology.
in the original one, and we say, we're talking round numbers here rather than being...
And even just that some of them, we've kind of counted them as being stacked, as opposed to kind of, some of them were existing at the same time.
Well, this was one of the problems with the chronology of Israel and Judah. Then when you added up Israel's kings and how many years they reigned, and Judah's kings and how long they reigned, it was like that. It just didn't match up.
Yeah.
And it was Dr. Edwin Thiele who wrote a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, where he solved that one. Mm-hmm. And if you want to talk about the different ways of dating kings, it's not bedtime reading. If you want to ask the question on Working the Word Facebook page, then we'll try and explain it in simple language for you. But they had two different calendars working and two ways of counting kings' reigns. And two ways of... So there were four different possibilities.
And so when you start looking at all the different variables you're working with, it's a lot.
But when you can synchronise with a nation beside you...
That helps.
That really does help us to get the chronology right. And when you can sync their chronology to a star reading, it's even better. So that's dealing with their eastern neighbours. Assyria, Babylon, Moab... But they also have a southern border, Egypt.
Mm-hmm. They have a long and complicated history with Egypt.
And they had a lot of interaction with Egypt. And way back there, we think we can synchronise it. When we get down here, it's a whole lot more difficult. Around about here, Israel is leaving Egypt, but we're not seeing anything in Egypt. And it's a problem. I missed that one. Here's another one from Sennacherib. It says he made Hezekiah a prisoner in Jerusalem, like a bird in a cage.
You can kind of feel the disdain dripping off it, but again, you've got this picture of, how the kings of the time typically recorded their adventures, and then you've got this contrast with the kings in the Israelite account who were recorded in a much more human, honest way.
And we do have record of Hezekiah's struggles. And in the end, Sennacherib lost 180,000 men in one night to an angel visit. You ought not to write things down too early in your...
Yeah.
All right, so what about Egypt? We do have some interesting things in Egypt. And what we have here is a map of the Fayum oasis. It's below sea level. And there's actually a canal that comes off the Nile and goes down and feeds this very fertile area and makes it into quite a breadbasket. Down there, there's some pyramids, 12th, 13th dynasty, made of mud bricks. And I actually have one. You can look at it and you can actually see the straw still there after 3,500 years or however long. And so we'll say, well, mud bricks, that's interesting.
Particularly with straw, that lines up. That
does line up with the Bible story. Adjacent to the one at Hawara is a canal. And if you look at it on the maps even today, it's called Bar Yosef.
Sounds a little suspiciously similar to Joseph, doesn't it?
Yosef is the Islamic way of saying Joseph's canal.
And, even if you're looking at this from the context of, not paying attention to this, you have, sort of local place names that are giving clues as to the presence of the people there.
And an area that's been opened up for agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Near another pyramid, the pyramid at Kahun, Sir Flinders Petrie did a lot of work. And it's recorded in Rosalie David's book, The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt. Mm-hmm. He excavated the village of the workers. And his conclusions were that these people were Semitic, or Asiatics, he called them. That was their name for people from up that way. Mm-hmm. As they excavated under the floor of these houses, they found a whole lot of wooden boxes, often containing the skeletal remains of 3 or 4 babies under 3 months old. And this is not the Egyptian way of doing things.
And yet it lines up with the story we have where, Pharaoh's getting a bit worried that the Israelites are getting too powerful to take and might take over. And so orders the midwives to kill.
And when the midwives are too slow, he orders the military
yes.
to do it. And it's a bit of a gross story. But, here are these wooden boxes with us. And again, this is just going ding, ding. This just sounds...
There's something familiar here. It connects up.
And his conclusion was that they just up and left for no particular reason. And he determined that. He said, look at the stuff that they left behind. When they went, they didn't take their stuff with them. They basically up and what they could carry and everything else.
Left in a hurry.
They just, it was unpremeditated.
And when you've got stories like, archaeology's kind of going, okay, well, this is the evidence we have. It's not that, we're looking for stuff that matches up. It's that the stuff is here and it lines up.
Except. By the traditional chronology of Egypt, this happened about 500 years before the date that we had there for the Exodus.
Which is a bit problematic.
That's a problem. And this is why we don't say that archaeology proves the Bible. It does illustrate it and illuminate it. And chronology is one of those things, when we get our pet theories, it's hard to move it. But there have been a number, like Emmanuel Velikovsky, Don Corville. I picked it up from David Down, who felt that the chronology of Egypt actually needs to be revised. That there were a period where you had a number of pharaohs reigning simultaneously in different places. And if you then just add the length of their reign all together,
you're going to get a much longer
one. And I'm inclined towards their theory that we actually need to shorten. And if that's the case, this may very well be the Israelites as slaves. We know they were making mud bricks. Mm-hmm. We know that they had babies being killed. We know that they suddenly left.
And it's the kind of details that wouldn't sort of, fit a lot of stories, that there's sort of very specific details. Mm-hmm.
After they left, suddenly the whole kingdom is weakened and the Hyksos come in. Mm-hmm. When they become strong again, if we were to make that little movement, then suddenly kings like Thutmose would be the one that came and conquered Jerusalem just after the time of Solomon. Mm-hmm. He's put up a list on a wall down there of all the things he took from the temple at Kadesh, and Kadesh means holy, the holy city. Mm-hmm. And it matches very much what Solomon said he put in there. So it's one of those what-ifs. It's interesting, and maybe it does illuminate the Bible story. but we are cautious.
Even if it doesn't sort of, we can't, sometimes we have a need for sort of certainty and for like nailing it down black and white, whereas sometimes this gives us some ideas, but it's not necessarily, the priority of archaeology isn't to prove the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's to see, what is actually there. And, sometimes it may take some time to sort of figure out, and sometimes there might be some discrepancies over how particular things are interpreted. And
sometimes we have to revise our theories rather than being dogmatic.
Yes.
And the danger is eisegesis, that we find what we're looking for rather than find what's there and then...
And I think in some ways, like, there's some distinctions to be made because, with some of this informing your imagination, there is some eisegesis involved in that it's eisegesis itself isn't, seeing, like looking for things isn't necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Being able to relate to particular things or bringing your own experience to understanding the text isn't necessarily bad. But we also need to keep it in right relationship with, what the text is giving us. That, we can kind of fill in some of the gaps and make it come alive. But we also need to remember that what we're filling in with is not sort of the facts that we're joining the dots.
And we need to acknowledge what we're doing. There's also biblical people that are interesting. Mm-hmm. For example, Pilate, who was the governor who let them get away with crucifying Jesus. Mm-hmm. When we go to Caesarea, and I'd love to take you to Caesarea sometime, up there's an inscription that they found chiseled in. And you'll notice Tiberium, who was the emperor, and then down in the second line, Pilate. All chiseled there, I suppose, in Latin, is it? Bible characters like Cyrus, who left us this cylinder to tell us his stories. Nabonidus, who is the son or grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And we also read about Belshazzar in a cylinder that he left behind. For a long time, the critics said, Bible doesn't know what it's talking about. Belshazzar doesn't exist. And by the Greek time, the time of the Seleucids, they'd forgotten all about him. Mm. But when they found the Nabonidus cylinder, they discovered that, what do you know? The Bible was right.
And in quite a few cases, there's been that, the Bible, like there's no other reference to this. It just can't be true. And then there's just, it's not an overwhelming, there's just a tiny reference that has to kind of make you question again, wait, maybe it's onto something.
We've got kings like Hezekiah. Mm-hmm. And he did interesting things like, I guess it wasn't drought-proofing the city of Jerusalem, but siege-proofing it. Mm-hmm. And built a tunnel that goes for more than 1 kilometre to take water through, coming out of the pool of Siloam.
Because if you've got a city without water, you've got problems.
And as the lady who was walking ahead of me found, the water was reasonably deep if you had short legs. Mm. And right in the middle, he had an inscription talking about how it was done and how when they met and they didn't quite meet up and then they had to turn sideways and join it all up. And suddenly some of these interesting places that are talked about in the Bible, you can go there, you can have a look at it.
And I can totally imagine the whole, you're working in this giant project and you get almost there and realise you've got to kind of...
Except it was a number of metres. Yes. But both lots could hear each other and so they turned... Fascinating stuff. Mm. This one maybe informs our picture of Jesus. This is called the Herodium. It's a conical hill that was extended upwards by about 11 stories by King Herod of killing the baby boys at the time of Jesus' birth fame. Mm-hmm. This is basically his citadel, his fortress, 5 kilometres from Bethlehem. So when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he was born right under the nose of King Herod. And it's not surprising that King Herod was not pleased to have this happening so close to home.
It's kind of deeply unsettling, like particularly when he's already a little bit wary of, people coming and trying to take over. Suddenly this baby being born and all these possibilities of people getting hope and things happening and under his nose.
He's already knocked off a couple of sons here because he thought they were getting too uppity and wanting his throne.
There's a deep, deep insecurity there.
And when you get up inside the top, it actually goes down like the, the cavity at the top of a volcano. It's almost hollow up there. Again, love to take you there. It's an interesting place to visit. Oh, well, there we go. That's just some of it and the fortifications, and originally there were apparently another couple of levels above this, but time has brought them down. Over in Jordan, at Madaba, there is an interesting church, the Church of St. George. And as they excavated to rebuild it, they found a mosaic floor. It's a map of the Holy Land. And so if you say, how do we know where places are? Here's a map from the early centuries, and if we look down, just over there, Jericho. Well, that's if you can read the Greek characters. The Jordan River, the Dead Sea. And this is just a small portion of that map. But it's part of how we do the process of...
And give some indication that, at this point, marking out their story and where things happened and, their place in this space was important to them at the time.
It was. And then sometimes stories just help our understanding of the Bible story. Jesus told a story in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7. Everyone who hears my words and obeys them is like a wise man who built his house on rock. It rained hard, the floods came, the winds blew and hit that house, but it did not fall because it was built on rock. Everyone who hears my words and does not obey them is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. It rained hard, the floods came, the winds blew and hit that house, and it fell with a big crash.
And sometimes when we picture that, the sand, like we kind of, he's built on the beach or something.
Beach. Maybe the lake shore. Until you go over and actually look at the geography. And there are a lot of wadis. Now, a wadi is a dry riverbed. The climate in Palestine means that it only rains 4 months of the year. And for the remainder, the other 8 months...
Cheap real estate.
It's cheap real estate. And if you're into cheap real estate, you build your house in the Wadi.
It means you will have to relocate temporarily.
In 8 months' time, you will have it washed away and then you have to build your house once more. Living for the now, for the short term, rather than the long term. And suddenly we have just another story coming alive that, they built in a wadi.
Because, it seems a little bizarre if you're thinking about, here, beachfront property is prime property. Like, why wouldn't you build there? Even, it's a bit of a sacrifice. Building on a beachfront, how terrible. Whereas, this kind of gives us a bit more of an idea as to the kind of the 3D-ness of the story and what they would have understood.
So there are so many interesting places. Wouldn't you like to be able to do a Bible Lands tour? I'm sure it would be fun, don't you? To be able to just make your way there. And right at the moment, nobody's travelling anywhere. And it's expensive.
And not always safe.
Not always safe, and certainly not COVID safe.
No.
But what if we could do a virtual Bible Lands tour? Any takers?
I've spent quite a lot of time this week wandering around like Jerusalem, and I didn't necessarily know what I was looking at, but you know, there's so many places around there just you can virtually wander.
And what we're doing at the moment, we're actually doing a virtual tour of part of the city of Petra in Jordan. Up at El Dir, or the monastery is the other thing that it's called. And yeah, it's a little bit jerky, but it's just fascinating to be able to go there, to look at it, to do a 360.
To be able to sort of click and move around and, you know, be able to look up and around, not just sort of a quick photo.
That we actually live in a day and age where we can do a virtual tour and see some of these places that we've just been talking about and get a little bit of a sense of them. Now, if you're wanting to go there, yes, you are going to have to climb some steps.
Quite a lot of steps.
And every few steps, you're going to stop and huff and puff unless you're in really good condition. But with a virtual tour, and what we're suggesting is that if you can actually go and see some of these places for yourself, that it just brings it into a new light.
I mean, clearly it's not quite the same as, you know, actually being able to go there and, you know, there's something really deeply experiential and tangible about literally walking there and feeling the air and seeing it and hearing it. But at the same time, free has a lot going for it too.
Free really does suit my budget at the moment. And we're just catching up to those donkeys up there at the moment. With Petra here, you can actually go pretty much the whole way through Petra in virtual, just through a freely available feature called Google Maps or Google Earth. Oh dear, he's lost a box of apple. Oh,
something.
Yeah, he's lost a box of oranges off his donkey.
And like, again, you know, they're still using donkeys to carry stuff around here.
And you actually see a whole lot of how they actually used to be. And I'm pretty sure he's up there. Let's go up and just see what he... Yep, it's oranges. Oh, dear. If we want to understand the Bible, sometimes it's really helpful to go there to inform our imagination. You know, there's other places we can go. We could duck into Petra. We don't want this to go on too long, but, you know, the feeling of being able to come out through the Sikh to see what's called the Treasury Building. We don't believe that's what it was, and then just to do a 360 to look around to see what it looked like. Does that sound fascinating to you?
Like I said, I spent a lot of time this week just wandering around.
You've done it for researching for a number of projects, just to get the sense of what was it like.
Particularly if I'm writing, you know, about Bible characters or whatever, like, you know, if I'm writing about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, I'll go to Bethany and wander around for a bit. Like, clearly the visuals have changed, you know, the buildings are a little bit more modern. It doesn't look exactly like it would have, but you can still get a feel for the landscape and the feel of the area. There's a lot in Jerusalem you can do as well.
So some of you might find this fascinating. And if that's the case, Annali and I want to introduce you to and invite you to come on a virtual guided Bible Lands tour via Zoom.
It's a bit strange, but let's go there.
we have not ever done this before, so it's purely experimental. But if you think you might be interested in this, Saturday afternoon at 4, and I know a lot of people also watch this on Sunday, so we're going to do a repeat one on Sunday. There's no tickets needed. It's not going to cost you anything. It's completely COVID-19 safe. And we'll put the details of how to connect to it on the Lithgow Church website and also on the Working the Word Facebook page.
Now, just to sort of be clear that, this is a freely available tool. You can go right now and wander around in Google Maps, walk on the streets of Jerusalem. One of the things that I noticed this week is I was doing a lot of wandering around. I'm like, I have no idea what that is or what happened here. It's a pyramid. I'm not sure which pyramid. So, you're more than welcome to just go and wander around Google Maps. We'll put up a bit of a tutorial as to how to use it on the Facebook page. If you're not familiar with it, but if you want to actually go and have somebody who can explain what this was or what's going on here, I think sometimes having a guide can help.
But also being interactive, so that if you say, look, I'd really like to see such and such a place, we may be able to go there straight away, or we may say, well,
we'll get there.
We'll go there on tour number 2.
Yeah.
And we're happy to run tours of different places for your pleasure at no extra expense. The other interesting thing that we've got that may be useful for some of you, I've called it My Bible Places. It's actually something I've put together for the young people and the children in the Lithgow Church when I'm teaching. And all of these purple dots are different Bible places. And just knowing where the different places were. And eventually we're going to link each of these into the maps that we were just looking at too for interaction.
And you can add, this is sort of anybody can make a Google My Map, but you can be adding, yes, these are the places, but you can be adding pictures and stories and kind of getting a context for how everything, this is when they were wandering in the desert, or this is how far it was from here to here, or this is the Jericho, that you can be making your own notes.
And with this, you can actually be measuring how far apart things are. It's just fascinating if you want to explore a little bit more of the archaeological background, the geography, the history of the place. Here's just another tool, and we'll have a link to this on the Facebook page also this week.
Yep.
So our tip this week for understanding the Bible, and we've tried to do a little bit of it. Our imagination does have to fill in some of the gaps. Let's work to inform our imaginations. A little bit of the history, the geography, the timing.
It kind of makes it come alive, I think. That, it's not just stories on a page, it's people and it's places and it's things happening, and you can kind of get into there, particularly if you're looking at Psalms and stuff where they're literally talking through their, some of the inner thoughts, but you can really kind of get into understanding that was a weird decision. Let's have a look at, what factors were on they were facing, how they might have been feeling as they were making that decision, what people around them were influencing. There's just so many kind of layers that you can look at.
Real people, real places, real history. We hope you can join us again next week for our next episode, when we're going to be looking at understanding prophecy in the Bible. Until then, God bless, and we hope that you have a fantastic week. We might even see some of you on the virtual tour.